So I recently picked up the 16-35mm f2.8 G Master version 2, as you can see right here. However, I am also an original owner of the 16-35 G Master version 1, and so while I have both of these lenses in my possession, I figured this would be the perfect time to do a comparison of each of these lenses' specs and features, talk about some of their different characteristics, compare a few different sample images, and overall give my take on these two lenses so you can make the right call as to which is the best option for you. So to kick things off, let's start with some of the obvious differences. One of the things you're going to first likely notice about each of these lenses is, in fact, the slight difference in size. So while both the version 1 and version 2 are 3.5 inches in diameter, the version 1 comes in at around 4 7/8 inches long, while the version 2 comes in at around 4.5 inches long. Now this difference is also going to come into play when it comes to weight. Each of these lenses are going to weigh a slightly different amount, with the version 1 weighing in at 680 grams and the version 2 weighing in at around 547 grams. In truth, the original 16-35 G Master is actually very similar now in weight to the 24-70 G Master version 2. Now, if we were to examine their lens hoods just very briefly, you will notice a slight size and design difference between these two as well. This being the version 1, this being the version 2. So putting the lens hoods aside for a moment, let's talk about just some of the similarities between the two. Each of these lenses contain 11 aperture blades, have an aperture range of f2.8 to f22, and have an 82mm front filter thread for adapting different filters and step-up rings to these lenses. If you are wondering how well each of these lenses maintain their focal length, say when held upside down or doing a shake test, I can tell you that they both will stay at whatever focal length you place them at, so that is not an issue. Now in terms of physical lens characteristics, I will say this is one area where you will certainly notice a difference between these two, primarily with the version 1 maintaining a very similar set of controls and features to the 24-70 G Master version 1, and of course the 16-35 version 2 having many similarities to the 24-70 G Master version 2. Now as a more specific example of this, we have an autofocus and manual focus switch here along the side, as well as a single programmable button that you can use to, say, do focus hold, among other things with the lens. You have the main zoom ring and control here, which I would say bears a similar type of resistance and feel to the 24-70 G Master version 1 as well, and the manual focus ring towards the front of the lens. That said, that is the extent of the controls on the version 1, whereas the version 2 is going to come with a lot more, at least physical, bells and whistles. So with the 16-35 G Master version 2, we again have our autofocus to manual focus toggle switch along the side, though we now have not just one, but also a second programmable button that can be used. Perhaps one of the more obvious differences is going to be the aperture control ring that most of Sony's newer G Master lenses have, and that includes the version 2 of the 24-70 and 70-200. This aperture control ring includes an iris lock, which now is locked. However, if I were to flip this off, as you're going to see here in a second, I can now adjust and control the aperture. Right now, of course, this is set to the clicked setting. However, I could also choose to make this a declicked experience when turning the aperture ring, as we'll do now. Beyond that, again, we have our main zoom control ring here, which is towards the center of the lens, and I would say a slightly less extending barrel compared to the original 16-35 G Master, and the manual focus ring towards the front of the lens again. Now yes, each of these lenses, like all of the G Masters, are dust and moisture resistant. The version 1 does contain 2 autofocus motors, while the version 2 contains 4 new linear XD motors. The minimum focus distance is also going to slightly vary on each of these, with the version 1 having a minimum focus distance of around 11 inches, and the version 2 coming in at around 8.7 inches. And yes, both of these lenses come with their respective hoods, as we discussed before, the usual expected front and rear Sony lens caps, and the soft padded case you would typically find with most G Master lenses. But now that we've explored some of the differences between these lenses' physical specs and features, let's take a look at some image and video samples and start to compare their different characteristics from another angle. Alright, so here in Lightroom, just evaluating some uncompressed raw photos taken on my Sony a7R5 of both of these. Here we have the version 1 16-35 at 16mm, f2.8 with profile corrections on, and now off, on, and off. Now with the 16-35 G Master version 2 at 16mm with the same exact settings, profile corrections on, off, on, off. If we were to do the same to the version 1 at 35mm, profile corrections on, off, on, off. And at 35mm, on, off, on, off. I would say barrel distortion wise, these lenses are fairly similar at their wide end, not unexpected of course for any wide angle lens, and maybe ever so slightly less pin cushioning with the 16-35 version 2 at the 35mm end, but this is really sort of splitting hairs at a certain point. Now if we were to evaluate sharpness between each of these two lenses, here we have the 16-35mm version 1 at 16mm zoomed in here, and as you can see at f2.8 aperture we are very sharp towards the center of the lens. Evaluating the lens at f4 in the center of the image, f5.6, f8, f11, only seeing it slightly taper off at the f16 mark, and of course a bit more of a taper there at f22. And in evaluating sharpness at the corners of the image for the version 1, and you'll see at f2.8, all things considered, far from a perfect test here, but we're still fairly sharp. This is only going to become even more sharp once we get to f4, as you see here, and further shown at f5.6, at f8, f11, f16, and again, largely keeping much of the sharpness all the way to f22. Alright, and so now evaluating the sharpness of the 16-35 G Master version 2 at 16mm. You will see here at f2.8 in the center of the image, we have an extremely sharp image here, I would say. Perhaps even a tad bit more sharp compared to the version 1, though again, we might be splitting hairs here. And this remains just as true once we're at f4, at f5.6, at f8, f11, at f16, perhaps even maintaining a bit better sharpness there compared to the version 1. And yes, only finally starting to taper off around f22. Now when evaluating the sharpness at the corners of the 16-35mm version 2 at 16mm. Again, at f2.8, we have a very sharp image here at the corner. I would say perhaps a little more sharp than compared to the version 1. That continues to get even more sharp at around f4, f5.6, f8, f11, at f16, again, maybe slightly tapering off, but still a tad bit sharper than the version 1, and more so tapering off around f22. Overall, I would say these are both extremely sharp lenses, particularly for being wide-angle zooms. I would give a slight edge in sharpness to the version 2 in at least a couple of cases, but again, would you notice these differences in the real world? That perhaps is an open question. Also worth noting that when it comes to chromatic aberration, I really don't see any much of that going on when evaluating some of the different image samples with the version 1. And yes, surprise, surprise, I'm not seeing much of this going on with the version 2 as well. Now, in terms of focus breathing, I will say I notice a difference between the version 1 and the version 2. The version 2 having almost nearly no detectable focus breathing. Yes, and that includes even when testing this on a Sony camera without breathing compensation enabled, with a somewhat more noticeable difference here when it comes to evaluating the version 1. That said, I wouldn't consider either of these lenses focus breathers from the perspective of usual Sony lenses that are known to have these characteristics. That said, much of all of this is a moot point once you turn on breathing compensation in any of the newer Sony bodies, so really I wouldn't worry about this too much. In terms of bokeh, I would say that these lenses are, well, G Masters, and so they each produce very nice, round, pleasing, spherical bokeh that you will not be disappointed with in either of these cases, and in fact, offer very similar performance in that regard. And even in the realm of autofocus performance, I would say these are more similar in many cases than you might think. Yes, that even includes with the added and new linear XD motors that are in the version 2. These are just some cursory tests here using the A7R5 and including its latest AI autofocus-based technology, not even tuned to the fastest autofocus settings, but overall I found very good snappy results that certainly live up to the G Master name. Now in terms of more image samples and examples beyond what I've shown here, I'm going to be doing a more thorough and in-depth review on both the version 1 and the version 2 16-35mm G Masters here on the channel, so certainly subscribe if you want to check those out. In terms of what you're seeing now on screen with these different examples, I will say that these both produce exceptional results on the photography and videography side, so certainly you won't be let down in either case. Fun fact, for this exact shot that you're seeing now, I typically use the 16-35mm G Master to film this. However, of course, I can't in this case because I'm now using both of these to film this video, and so right now I'm filming this video with the 20mm f1.8G lens, which yes, I've already done a separate review of on this channel that I believe a link to above and in the description below that you can check out. But for a fun little test here using my A7S III, do you notice a difference between these different shots I'm now cycling through? Without the insider knowledge I have in filming these and in now identifying them as you're seeing, I'm not sure if I could tell the difference between either of the 16-35s or the 20mm G, but could you? Let me know in the comments below. Now, of course, in talking about each of these lenses, we should mention price. As it stands currently, the 16-35 G Master version 1 retails for around $1,900 US, while the version 2 16-35 currently retails for around $2,300 US. In truth, I would perhaps expect the price of the version 1 to go down slightly over time, much like the 24-70 and 70-200 has, whether new or used. But yes, as it stands, there's only a $400 difference between these two, and perhaps that leads us into what my final thoughts are on each of these lenses. If there's a pair in the GM version 1 and 2 trio that bears more similarities to each other than differences, it is probably the 16-35. Without a doubt, the version 1 and version 2 are both solid performers in so many different ways. These two punch well above their weight class for being a wide-angle zoom, and yes, that is even still true of the version 1, which being released in 2017 is actually the newest of the GM version 1 trios that have now all been replaced by their version 2 counterparts. I really think there's an argument you can make in either case for either one of these, but that's going to depend on what you're looking for. If you don't need all of the physical bells and whistles that the version 2 has on the body side, and don't mind a bit of extra size and weight for the version 1, and yes, especially if you own a version 1 currently, I would say that is probably the one to go with and or stick with. That said, if you like all of the newer features of the latest Sony G Master lenses, whether that's the aperture control ring, or the size and weight improvements, or the slight differences in sharpness, breathing compensation, etc., then the version 2 might justify its additional $400 in price point, and in fact, if you're looking for a net new wide-angle zoom to purchase, it might be hard to argue against getting the version 2 for that reason alone. Really, in either case, these are both stellar options, and so kudos for Sony in taking a phenomenal lens and making it even just that much better. So that is my take on comparing the 16-35mm f2.8 G Master version 1 and 2. Hopefully this video has been of some help to you. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe if it has. I have a number of related lens reviews on the channel that I will leave linked to above and in the description below that I would definitely encourage you to check out, and yes, there will be many more on the way. For now, that is all I have to say, so thanks for watching.